Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, 2 years ago, on the 15th of November 2019, following a sudden decision by the Islamic Republic of Iran to triple the price of fuel, protests broke out across Iran. In a short time, the protests spread around many of the cities. They lasted for 5 days. The affected cities covered most, if not all, of the 31 provinces in Iran. The Iranian government acknowledged that at least 200,000 people took part in the protests, although the evidence suggests that the numbers could be much higher. The evidence suggests that most of the protests appear to have been relatively peaceful. Although there was verbal confrontation, stone throwing, and damage to property, the protesters were not armed. Very few security actors appear to have been harmed. The protests were met, nonetheless, with violence and brutality. In the days that followed, amid a total internet shutdown, the Islamic Republic of Iran's security forces, including the ordinary police, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Basij, and plainclothes forces, which operate, amongst others, under the command of the Ministry of Intelligence, acted to put an end to the protests. Many protesters and others were subject to violence, killed, injured, arrested, tortured, and/or mistreated. Amnesty International have verified that there were at least 323 deaths across 37 cities. Many of those victims had been shot in the head or upper torso, indicating that they were targeted with an intention to kill or seriously injure. We, the panel, have no doubt that this figure is only a fraction of the actual deaths that occurred as a result of the actions of the security forces. Reports by the UN and other international organizations and numerous witnesses confirm that thousands of people were arrested during and following the protests. Detainees were held by a variety of the security agents, often without access to family or lawyers. Many were subjected to torture and ill treatment designed to intimidate and humiliate and/or force the victims to admit criminal conduct or implicate foreign forces or agents for their involvement in the protests. As confirmed by scores of witnesses, ill treatment and torture included electric shocks, sexual violence and threats, beatings, waterboarding, and being forced into physically stressful positions. Over the last 5 days, the Eiban Tribunal has held oral hearings in which evidence related to these events has been heard. We have heard from 33 witnesses themselves or whose families or loved ones were killed, injured, or disappeared. We've heard from expert witnesses who have testified on a variety of subjects, ranging from the number of deaths and injuries, testifying about the thousands of videos which have been recovered, the firearms and weapons used by the security forces, the relevant Iranian law, and the manner in which the domestic judicial process worked to criminalize the protesters and deprive them of redress. Most of these witnesses are independent and do not know each other. Although there is some variance in the accounts, they raise a serious case against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Apart from implicating the Republic and their security apparatus in a scheme to repress the protests at any cost, they provide a reasonable basis to believe that the Iranian forces subjected the protesters or those suspected of being involved in the protests to unlawful killings, serious physical and mental harm, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, torture, and other ill treatment to brutalize the protesters and persuade the protesters from any future attempt to exercise their right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. Unfortunately, almost 2 years to the day, apparently pursuant to the Supreme Leader's order, the Islamic Republic of Iran has taken no steps to initiate criminal proceedings, judicial inquiries, or other steps to uncover the truth or bring those responsible to justice. Investigations conducted by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, the UN Secretary General, and organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Justice for Iran, and Iran Human Rights provide evidence of the efforts of victims and members of their families to uncover the truth of what happened and the manner in which they have been frustrated, with many, if not all, being subject to reprisals, threats, and further abuses. State institutions, including the revolutionary courts and criminal courts, have also disregarded obligations to undertake these investigations as required by their own domestic laws. The Islamic Republic of Iran's prosecutors, judges, and justice system as a whole are implicated in this cover-up and the overall plan to commit these crimes. The panel would like to pay homage to the victims and survivors who have provided their testimony to us over the last 5 days and to the tribunal over the last 2 years. They have done so despite this harassment and despite the threat of reprisals against themselves and their families. The panel has been moved and impressed with their courage and determination to hold the Islamic Republic of Iran to account. Their testimony was clear, largely consistent, and persuasive. Regrettably, the Islamic Republic of Iran has chosen not to attend these hearings or participate in the investigations conducted by Mr. Sabi's team. It is, however, not too late. Having been established at the initiation of 3 civil society organizations, Justice for Iran, Iran Human Rights Center, and Together Against the Death Penalty, in response to the requests of victims and families of the victims, the Eban Tribunal consists of independent and impartial jurists with a mandate to investigate these crimes and violations. We therefore continue to encourage all witnesses to come forward, including state representatives, and we will consider all the evidence and take it all into account. Accordingly, we welcome the Islamic Republic of Iran and any response they may have to the evidence against them and their agents. As we have said, the evidence currently raises a serious case against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that case suggests they are responsible for a variety of crimes against humanity, including killing, extermination, torture, detention, enforced disappearances, and persecution. and numerous human rights violations, including violations of the right to live, the prohibition against torture and ill treatment, and the right to freedom of protest and expression. The Iranian government should respond and answer these charges. Indeed, international law demands that they do so. They have the panel's commitment to consider that evidence with the same independence, impartiality, as we consider all the evidence we've heard to date. For now, we must adjourn these hearings to consider any and all evidence that we have received or may receive. We welcome the evidence of those who have offered to testify since we began these hearings 5 days ago. In light of the scope of the new evidence being offered to the tribunal, we may well have further hearings so that the new witnesses can be heard and examined. We, as a panel, remain committed to determining the truth of these events in light of the principles of law, human conscience, and justice. As we stated at the outset, any findings ultimately made as a result of this process will be consistent with universal principles of justice, protection, and enforcement of the rule of law, public acknowledgement of the right of victims and respect for the rights of persons, groups, or governments the tribunal may identify as bearing responsibility for the acts in question. Until then, we now postpone these hearings. Shortly, we will publicize how these hearings will be completed, with the judgment to be issued in early 2022. We reiterate our thanks to those who have supported and publicized these hearings and the tribunal's ongoing search for the truth. Thank you. Thank you.